Picture this, deep in the Polish countryside, hidden beneath mountains and camouflaged by forests, far from the eyes of the Allies, far from the knowledge of the Soviet advance, far even from the full awareness of the Nazi government itself, German scientists in the final days of World War II are conducting an experiment so secret, so classified, so compartmentalized, that even now, more than 70 years later, no one can say with absolute certainty whether it ever actually existed at all, whether it was real or an elaborate fiction spun by desperate men in desperate times, or whether it remains hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough or curious enough to seek it out. They call it Die Glocke, the bell. And according to the handful of accounts that survived the war, it was a machine unlike anything else the world had ever seen. A device that allegedly violated the laws of physics as we understood them. A Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. That could have changed the course of the entire war if only it had been perfected in time. But here's what makes this story so captivating, so deeply mysterious. There is no photograph, no blueprint, no verified mechanical component, no scientific documentation that has ever been found that can definitively prove it existed. And yet, the legend persists, growing larger and more fantastical with each passing year, spawning theories about anti-gravity, about time travel, about technology so advanced that it makes our modern science look primitive by comparison. We are about to take you on a journey into one of World War II's greatest unsolved mysteries, a journey that will require us to separate fact from fiction, to examine the testimony of those who claim to have seen it, to understand the context of Nazi scientific desperation, and to explore the question that haunts every serious historian who has ever investigated this strange case. Did the Nazis create something in those final months that we still don't fully understand? The story begins, as so many Nazi horror stories do, with the toxic marriage of ideology and science, with the moment when a twisted political movement took control of one of Europe's most scientifically advanced nations and bent its considerable intellectual resources toward the creation of weapons of unimaginable destructive power. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party consolidated their grip on power with stunning speed and terrifying efficiency, Germany possessed some of the finest scientific minds in the world, researchers and engineers who had made extraordinary contributions to physics, chemistry, aviation, and rocketry. Brilliant men who had published groundbreaking research that shaped the entire direction of modern science. The regime understood that technological superiority could compensate for material disadvantages, understood that a nation that lacked the raw materials and the industrial capacity of its enemies might nevertheless achieve victory through clever engineering and scientific breakthrough. And so they invested heavily in research programs with names that sound like they came from the pages of science fiction. The SS Wunderwaffe Bureau, the Technical Division, research divisions and secret laboratories dedicated to creating weapons that might deliver victory from what seemed an increasingly hopeless situation. By 1943 and 1944, with Germany facing defeat on multiple fronts, with Soviet forces advancing from the east, with seemingly limitless manpower, with American and British forces pressing in from the west with superior air support and industrial might, with German cities being reduced to ash by bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, with the total war economy straining to its breaking point, the desperation grew ever more intense, and the technological fantasies ever more grandiose, ever more disconnected from physical reality, ever more dependent on hope and wishful thinking rather than sound engineering. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and scientific ambition that a physicist named Hans Kammler supposedly received funding and a team of researchers to work on a project that would later be called Die Glocke, a project that exists at the borderline between historical documentation and historical mystery. According to some accounts, Kammler was a brilliant but ruthless scientist who had already proven his ability to run massive, complex research programs involving thousands of workers, who had demonstrated his willingness to cut corners and sacrifice human beings in the pursuit of scientific and military objectives. And he was given virtually unlimited resources and authority to conduct whatever experiments he deemed necessary to win the war, whatever it would cost in human suffering. The project was supposedly located in Lower Silesia, in what is now Poland, in an area that Nazi Germany controlled until the very last weeks of the war, in a remote region with a harsh climate and difficult terrain, in a facility hidden deep underground, away from prying eyes and away from Allied bombing campaigns, away from the knowledge of the civilian population, built with the labor of concentration camp prisoners who would be killed once they were no longer useful. The few accounts we have of what Die Glocke actually was come primarily from two sources: a mysterious Italian journalist named Lulli, who claimed to have interviewed a man named Giuseppe Belluzzo, an Italian scientist and engineer who allegedly worked with the Germans on the project in some capacity, and who provided descriptions of what he allegedly saw, and a Polish engineer named Igor Witkowski, who in 2000 published a book called The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, based on alleged interviews with a Polish concentration camp survivor named Jakob Sporenberg, who claimed to have worked in the facility, who claimed to have witnessed the experiments, who claimed to have seen things that his mind could barely comprehend. According to these accounts, Die Glocke was a bell-shaped apparatus made of a metal called Cerium 525, a material that allegedly had extraordinary properties, and that was said to be incredibly heavy despite its relatively small size, roughly 40 feet in diameter and perhaps 50 or 60 feet tall. A massive bronze or metal bell suspended within some kind of rotating cylinder or chamber, filled with liquids and gases that were kept at extreme temperatures and pressures, working in some way that nobody fully understood, operating according to principles that seemed to defy conventional physics. The machine supposedly generated a humming or vibrating sound at certain frequencies, a sound that was described by those who heard it as haunting, as unsettling, as something that affected the human nervous system in ways that defied easy explanation. And those who encountered it reported a sickly sweet smell in the air, a chemical taste on their tongues, a sense of unease and disorientation when near it, a feeling of dread and foreboding that seemed to have no rational source. In some accounts, witnesses claimed that those who worked too closely with it suffered burns and radiation sickness among those who worked too closely with the device, that they developed mysterious illnesses, that some of them died without any clear medical explanation, that the machine left traces of its operation in the bodies of those who came near it. Some versions of the story claim that Die Glocke was based on theoretical physics, that it was an attempt to create an asymmetrical field of some kind, a gravitational anomaly that could be weaponized, that it was designed to produce effects that seemed to defy Newton's laws and Einstein's theories, creating the possibility of anti-gravity propulsion or some kind of mysterious energy generation that could power new weapons, or that could be weaponized in ways we can only guess at. Other accounts suggest it was actually a plasma reactor of some kind, a device that could generate extraordinary temperatures and energies, perhaps even a primitive atomic reactor or some forerunner of nuclear technology, something that could produce power on an unprecedented scale. Still other theories, increasingly speculative and increasingly divorced from anything resembling documented historical evidence, suggest that Die Glocke was a time machine, or a dimensional portal, or a device that could manipulate space and time itself, or something so far beyond conventional physics that we still lack the theoretical framework to understand what it really was. Technologies that would remain impossible for decades or centuries to come. Knowledge that the Nazis supposedly possessed, but that we still do not possess. But before we can evaluate these claims, Before we can begin to understand what we're really dealing with here, we need to establish what we actually know about the Nazi scientific establishment, about the genuine wonder weapons they did create, and about the very real historical context in which these stories emerged. The Nazi regime did indeed develop remarkable weapons, some of which changed warfare forever. The German rocket scientists, led by Wernher von Braun, created the V-2 rocket, a stunning achievement in engineering that pointed toward the future of space exploration and would eventually inspire the American space program. The Germans were also working on jet aircraft, on advanced submarines, on sophisticated radar systems, on various chemical and biological weapons programs. They had brilliant scientists working in physics, and the historical record shows that the regime was genuinely concerned about falling behind in theoretical physics, particularly in the field of nuclear research. And there was intense competition and pressure on scientists to produce results that could be weaponized. What's crucial to understand is that this was a regime willing to pursue scientific research without regard for human life, willing to use concentration camp prisoners as test subjects, willing to devote enormous resources to weapons programs that made little practical sense if they were pursuing actual military advantage, but that made perfect sense if we understand them as expressions of ideological obsession and desperate hope. So when we encounter claims about Die Glocke, we're not dealing with a regime incapable of ambitious scientific projects. We're dealing with a regime that was absolutely capable of such ambitions, which makes the mystery even more intriguing. The problem is that Die Glocke occupies a strange and deeply troubling space in historical documentation, exists in a liminal zone between myth and history, between what we can prove and what people claim to believe. It appears in no official Nazi documents that have ever been found, which is remarkable, which is deeply suspicious, which demands explanation, because the Nazis, despite their catastrophic failures as a military and political regime, despite their fundamental irrationality and their disconnection from reality in so many ways, were actually quite meticulous record keepers, were obsessive documentarians of their own activities. They documented their atrocities with bureaucratic precision. They created files and photographs and lists of those they murdered. They documented their weapons programs in detail. They recorded technical specifications. They created correspondence between different departments and agencies. They filed reports and memos and progress reports. They created files and correspondence and communications that have survived the war, and that historians and researchers have been poring over and analyzing for decades, searching for every scrap of information about what the Nazi regime was doing in its final days. Yet there is no mention of Die Glocke in any of these official records. No evidence that it was included in any budget allocations or in any accounting of scarce resources. No correspondence between scientists about its progress, or its problems, or its achievements. No technical drawings or specifications or blueprints filed away in some archive. Nothing that would normally and necessarily accompany such a major weapons program, such an ambitious scientific project, such an enormous commitment of resources and personnel. This absence of documentation is, in itself, historically significant, is something that demands our attention and our analysis. Could mean several different things. It could mean that the project was kept so secret, so compartmentalized, so hidden away from normal bureaucratic processes, that even the meticulous Nazi bureaucracy was kept in the dark about what was happening in these remote facilities, that only a handful of people knew the truth. That knowledge was so restricted that it did not leave traces in the normal documentary record. It could mean that all documentation was destroyed methodically and completely. As the war came to an end and the Nazis realized that defeat was imminent, that evidence of their weapons programs would be captured by the Allies, and that all records of Die Glocke were burned or buried or destroyed in a final act of covering up their work. Or it could mean, and this is what most mainstream historians, Most serious academic researchers, most scholars who have devoted their careers to studying this period have concluded that Die Glocke never existed at all, that it was a rumor, a legend, a myth that grew in the chaos of the war's final months, born in the confusion and fear and desperation of those final days, and in the decades afterward, when people were trying to make sense of the extraordinary and terrible period they had just lived through, when people wanted to find explanations for how things went so wrong, for why the world had been plunged into such darkness. The main evidence for Die Glocke comes from the testimonies of people who claimed to have seen it or worked on it. And these testimonies are deeply problematic in several important ways that scholars and historians must carefully consider. The Italian source, Giuseppe Belluzzo, was an engineer who did have connections to Nazi Germany during the war, who did work on various projects, but his accounts were second-hand, were reported by others, were filtered through the lens of a journalist whose motivations and reliability we know nothing about. And they lack the specific technical details that would normally accompany descriptions of an actual engineering project. The precise measurements and specifications and technical details that an engineer would naturally remember and describe. The Polish source, Jakob Sporenberg, was interrogated after the war and gave accounts of what he supposedly saw, of what he supposedly experienced in the facility. But interrogation records are notoriously unreliable, influenced by leading questions posed by interrogators who may have their own theories about what they're looking for, by the interrogators' expectations about what they want or need to find, by the interpreter's biases and linguistic choices that may subtly shape the testimony, by the passage of time and the trauma of having survived a concentration camp, by the desire to tell authorities what they want to hear in hopes of leniency or better treatment. Additionally, most of these testimonies only emerged decades after the war, 10, 20, 30 years or more after the alleged events, when the Soviet Union had taken control of the region where the supposed facility was located, making it completely impossible to verify any of the physical claims being made. To conduct any investigation into whether the structures supposedly built for Die Glocke actually existed, whether there were any material remains, whether any other evidence could be found. When researchers have actually gone to Poland and attempted to find the supposed location of the Die Glocke facility, have traveled to the remote regions of Lower Silesia where it was supposedly hidden, have interviewed local residents who lived in the area before and after the war, they have found no credible evidence of it. No structures, no remains, no artifacts, no physical evidence that would suggest that such a facility had ever existed in those locations. No machinery, no components, no anything that would support the claims being made in these accounts. And yet, the legend persists and has grown, and has even become incorporated into popular culture, spawning documentary series, conspiracy theories, and a seemingly endless supply of speculative theories about what it might have been. To understand why this legend has such staying power, why it resonates so deeply in our cultural consciousness even in the absence of credible evidence, we need to think about what this story represents psychologically and culturally. On one level, Die Glocke represents the ultimate lost technology. The idea that the Nazis discovered or created something so advanced, so powerful, that it might have changed everything. If only the war had lasted a few months longer. If only Hitler had listened to his scientists. If only they had had more time. It taps into a very deep fantasy, the idea that history could have gone a different way, that the outcome of the war was not inevitable, that technological breakthroughs might have altered the balance of power at the last possible moment. This is compelling stuff, narratively speaking, because it allows us to revisit the war with a sense of what if, with the possibility that things might have turned out very differently. On another level, Die Glocke represents the fear that the Nazis were more scientifically advanced that we want to acknowledge that they had, penetrated deeper into the secrets of physics and technology than we have. and that technology that we still do not understand might be lurking out there somewhere, hidden in secret vaults or in the hands of people who carried the knowledge away from Germany and have been guarding it in secret for generations. This speaks to a kind of technological anxiety. What if the world changed in ways we didn't understand? What if there are powerful forces at work that our science cannot explain? And on a third level, Die Glocke is appealing because it embodies a kind of romantic notion of science itself, the idea of the brilliant scientist working in secret, pursuing knowledge for its own sake, creating something extraordinary even in the midst of chaos and moral catastrophe. The idea that science transcends politics and ideology. The actual history of Nazi science is far more morally murky than this romantic notion. Nazi scientists were not neutral men in white coats who happened to work for an evil regime. Many of them were complicit in the regime's crimes. Many of them benefited from the use of concentration camp prisoners as research subjects. And many of them after the war were willing to obscure their own complicity and exaggerate their achievements to avoid prosecution or to attract interest from American and Soviet forces who were eager to exploit German technological knowledge. When we look at the actual documented cases of Nazi weapons programs, we see a much more complicated picture. Yes, the Germans did develop sophisticated weapons, but they also invested enormous resources in weapons programs that made no practical military sense, that were based on faulty physics or faulty engineering, that represented the desperation and irrationality of a failing regime more than they represented genuine scientific achievement. The German nuclear program, for instance, never came close to developing an atomic bomb. Despite having some of the finest physicists in the world available to them, they made crucial early errors. They failed to fully understand the physics involved. They diverted resources to other weapons programs, and they never achieved a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. This is a historical fact that should humble us all. One of the most advanced scientific nations in the world, with brilliant physicists at its disposal, failed to develop nuclear weapons, while the United States, with a much smaller reservoir of German scientific talent, succeeded. This suggests that technological achievement is not determined by ideology or determination alone, that there are real physical limitations to what can be accomplished, and that the romantic notion of the Nazi wonder weapons achieving what conventional weapons could not is probably fundamentally mistaken. So where does this leave us with Die Glocke? If we approach the question with the tools of history, with an emphasis on documentary evidence, on contemporary documentation, on material remains, on corroborated testimony, the answer is fairly clear. There is no credible evidence that Die Glocke ever existed. The testimonies that support its existence are second-hand, vague, uncorroborated, and often emerge decades after the alleged events. The supposed facility has never been found. Despite searches, no components, no diagrams, no documentation has ever surfaced. The stories grow more elaborate and more fantastic with each retelling, incorporating ideas from later scientific developments and from science fiction. The most likely explanation is that Die Glocke is a myth, born from the confusion and chaos of the war's end, embellished through decades of retelling, and now so embedded in popular culture that it has taken on a life of its own, independent of historical truth. But this doesn't mean the story is worthless, or that we should dismiss it entirely. Myths tell us something important about the cultures and periods that produce them, about what people fear, what they hope for, what they're trying to make sense of. The myth of Die Glocke tells us about how the world felt in the aftermath of World War II, tells us about the fear that the Nazis had been more advanced, more dangerous, more alien than we wanted to admit, tells us about the way that technological anxiety shapes our imagination. It also tells us something about how easily historical truth can be obscured, how stories can persist and grow in the absence of evidence, how the desire to believe in something can overcome our critical faculties. The story of Die Glocke has become a vehicle for exploring deeper questions about science, power, secrecy, and the nature of historical truth itself. In recent years, a more thoughtful scholarship has emerged around Die Glocke, with historians attempting to trace exactly how the legend developed, what accounts contributed to it, and how it grew and evolved over time. Scholars like Igor Witkowski have published books claiming to have evidence for Die Glocke's existence, but their evidence has been scrutinized by mainstream historians and found to be inconclusive at best. The accounts they rely on are not contemporary, are not documented in Nazi records, and are often based on testimonies that were taken long after the war, or that appear in sources of questionable reliability. Meanwhile, other researchers have attempted to find the actual facility, to conduct archaeological investigations in Poland and Germany, where Die Glocke was supposedly developed. And these investigations have consistently failed to produce any physical evidence whatsoever. One of the most interesting aspects of the Die Glocke story is how it has been adapted and reinterpreted over time. In the immediate post-war period, accounts focused on it being some kind of advanced weaponry. By the 1950s and 1960s, in the context of the space race and growing public interest in nuclear power, it was reinterpreted as an advanced reactor or an anti-gravity device. By the 1970s and 1980s, as interest in UFOs grew, some people began to suggest that Die Glocke was actually extraterrestrial technology that the Nazis had supposedly recovered. By the 2000s, it had been incorporated into various conspiracy theories, with some people claiming that the Nazis had perfected the technology and spirited it away to secret bases in South America or Antarctica. Each reinterpretation tells us more about the anxieties and fantasies of the period in which it occurs than it tells us about any actual historical fact. This is the real tragedy of Die Glocke. It has become so encrusted with myth and speculation that it has obscured rather than illuminated our understanding of Nazi science, of the actual weapons programs they pursued, of the real achievements and real failures of Nazi scientists. The genuine history is far more interesting and far more important than the myth. The history of Nazi science shows us how an evil regime corrupts science, how scientists can be complicit in atrocities, how brilliant minds can be bent toward destructive purposes. It shows us the actual limitations of scientific and technological achievement, the ways that ideology can blind even brilliant people to physical reality. It shows us how desperate regimes make poor decisions about resource allocation, how they invest in weapons programs that make no sense because they represent hope rather than reason. And it shows us something crucial about how historical truth is established and maintained through documentary evidence, through material remains, through contemporaneous accounts, through the painstaking work of historians who are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts our desires or our fantasies. The most important thing we can take from the Die Glocke story is not belief in the existence of some secret Nazi wonder weapon, but rather a deeper appreciation for how fragile historical truth really is, how easily myths can grow and become embedded in our collective memory, and how essential it is that we remain critically engaged with the sources of our historical knowledge. The few artifacts that do survive from Nazi scientific projects are far less romantic and far more disturbing than the legend of Die Glocke. They are the equipment used in concentration camp experiments, the designs for weapons that caused immense suffering, the documentation of programs that aimed at the systematic destruction of human populations. These are the real horrors that emerged from the marriage of Nazi ideology and scientific ambition, and they are far more important to understand and to remember than any speculative tale of a mysterious bell-shaped machine. In the final analysis, what Die Glocke represents is the human desire to find meaning and mystery in chaos, to believe that there are secrets waiting to be discovered, to imagine that history might have gone differently if only the right technology had been perfected at the right moment. These are not unreasonable desires. They're deeply human responses to living in a world of uncertainty and change. but they must be tempered by a commitment to truth, by a willingness to examine evidence critically, by a recognition that the absence of evidence for something that is supposed to be secret and hidden is not the same as evidence of absence. The story of Die Glocke will likely persist for generations to come, will continue to inspire speculation and theories, will continue to capture the imagination of people who are fascinated by the mysteries of history and by the possibilities of undiscovered technology. The Die Glocke mystery will endure in the popular imagination, will continue to spark documentaries and books and theories, will remain a fixture of World War II lore. And in some ways, this is not entirely a bad thing, as long as we remain clear about the difference between what we can prove and what we can only imagine, between documented history and speculative fiction. And perhaps that is as it should be. The questions we ask about Die Glocke, even if they never lead to definitive answers or definitive resolutions, push us to think more deeply and more carefully about how we know what we know, about what we believe and why we believe it, and about the complex and sometimes troubled relationship between science, power, secrecy, and historical truth in the modern world. In the end, the search for historical truth requires patience, rigor, and intellectual humility, requires that we be willing to follow evidence where it leads even when it takes us away from comfortable narratives or appealing stories, requires that we acknowledge the limits of what we can know with certainty about events that occurred decades ago and that were shrouded in secrecy even as they were happening. The Die Glocke mystery illustrates these principles in action, shows us a case where careful scholars have examined all available evidence and reached a consensus that the most likely explanation is that the machine never existed, even though the absence of definitive proof continues to allow room for alternative theories and continued speculation. This is how historical scholarship actually works, not through sensational discoveries or definitive proofs, not through grand theories built on speculation and circumstantial evidence, but through the patient and methodical accumulation of evidence, through the careful evaluation of sources and testimonies, through the willingness to change our minds when new evidence emerges, or when our understanding develops further, through the commitment to following facts wherever they lead, even when they contradict our initial assumptions or our deepest hopes about what the past contained. What remains clear is that the search for Die Glocke, whether it existed or not, reveals something profound about human nature, about our hunger for secrets and mysteries, about our desire to believe that there are forces and technologies beyond our understanding operating in the shadows of history, about our need to find narratives that make sense of the chaos and horror of war. The legend also reminds us of the dangers of allowing ourselves to become seduced by fantastic stories, of the importance of maintaining a commitment to evidence and to reason even when the stories are compelling, even when they offer appealing explanations for difficult historical questions. Throughout the history of World War II scholarship, there have been many such legends and myths. Many stories that seemed plausible and that captured popular imagination before being thoroughly debunked by careful historical research. The mystery of Die Glocke stands as a cautionary tale about how easily we can be led astray, how the most elaborate and fantastic stories can persist in the face of contradicting evidence, how the human mind creates meaning from ambiguity and fills in gaps in our knowledge with imagination and speculation. Yet we should not be entirely dismissive of the impulse that leads people to believe in Die Glocke, should not simply mock those who have dedicated time and energy to investigating this mystery. The desire to understand the past, to solve historical puzzles, to uncover hidden truths, is a noble one even when it sometimes leads us astray, even when our investigations ultimately prove fruitless or point toward conclusions different from what we initially believed. What matters most is not whether Die Glocke was real or fictional, not whether the machine actually existed or was purely a product of imagination and speculation, but rather how we approach such questions, what methods we use to evaluate evidence, what rigorous standards we hold ourselves to when it comes to establishing and defending historical truth.